I'm going to talk about China's sense of self. And in order to really understand, my basic hypothesis today is that the Chinese often behave in ways that are puzzling to us, and indeed sometimes troubling to us, to their neighbors, to the rest of the world. Naturally, it goes without saying that we Americans sometimes behave in ways that cause puzzlement, if not consternation, among our neighbors and the rest of the world. So that's nothing special about China. However, as you all know, China is clearly a rising power. It is a complicated, complex society. It has a very long history, and I'm not a historian. I'm a specialist on 20th century Chinese culture, Chinese literature, Chinese art. But anybody who spends their adult life the way I have, studying China, learns to appreciate the inextricable gravitational pull, that's a bad metaphor, the gravitational pull of history. China is a country, is a civilization which in many ways invented history. It has the longest continually recorded history of any civilization in the world. The Chinese have a historical record that goes back before 700 years before Christ. They have kept historical records of every day since more than 700 years before the time of Christ. And they always, always, always believed that history mattered. You never got anywhere in China telling Chinese people that history didn't matter. So it's necessary in order to explore the complicated and the many different influences on contemporary China's sense of self to take history into account. And today's talk will focus on the last, not quite 2 centuries, the last 180 years of China's history, which was very unusual for China, and indeed for the world. And I hope that the slides, the imagery, will help make this talk enjoyable and a bit more vivid. All right, as I'm not telling you anything you don't know, there are a lot of consumers in China. China is not the backward, monotonous, low income, no consumer good, Spartan, over-politicized society that it was when I first went there in 1972. As you know, China is now, in many ways, the factory to the world. How long has it been since you went into any store and bought an article of clothing that didn't say made in China? A long time. Shoes, consumer goods of all kinds. A huge number of Chinese people who 30 years ago were still working in backbreaking, low-paid agricultural drudgery now work in places that look like this and make quite a nice salary. This recent graph just came out, brand new graph, and according to this, which is actually from American the Heritage Foundation, a research scholar at the Heritage Foundation, put this graph together. That's a conservative think tank, if you don't know about them, put this graph together showing that in fact China's purchasing power just passed the United States at the end of this past year. So we're just now into a new phase where China has more purchasing power, total purchasing power, than the United States. So biggest market in the world is no longer the US according to this graph, if this is accurate. I can't swear to it, but Heritage Foundation's pretty reliable to put out a graph such as that. We're not talking about someone that has no capacity to defend itself. There is a major military power in the Far East that 30 years ago wasn't a major military power. Now, China goes back. I have many slides I took out because there were too many slides. This is to show you what it was like around 700, 750 Common Era in terms of the area that was under Chinese cultural and political control. You see how far west it goes out. That area is now Xinjiang. That's where the Uyghurs are very unhappy as a Muslim Islamic minority, Central Asiatic people. This part of China is what we call China proper. Back then, that's the area that was under Chinese imperial rule. I could show you the slide from 1,000 years before that, and this area would also be under Chinese control. 2,000 years before that, this area, in other words, 15. Do you see it? Sorry, I was moving it too fast. That area, 1,500 years before Christ, was Chinese cultural area. Very old civilization has been in this space for a long time. Jumping forward, as you probably know, after the Song dynasty, which followed the Tang dynasty, the Mongols took over. This is Genghis Khan. Kublai Khan becomes the emperor of China. So the Mongols conquer China, and the Mongols are an incredible people. 2 million, roughly 2 million Mongols had that enormous area. And if you see this path with the arrows, this is Marco Polo's 17 or 18 year, that's the way he went back, but he went through here. The reason Marco Polo could get there and Europeans couldn't get there before that was the Mongols had taken over everything. And if you got a letter that let you travel through Mongol-controlled territory, you could go, as Marco Polo did, all the way from Venice out to Karakoram. So the Mongols, for 100 years, controlled all of what is now China, governed it under the Mongol dynasty. But within 100 years, they had disunited. They were trying to control too much territory. Things fell apart, and the Chinese took over again in 1368 with the Ming dynasty. This is to merely remind you that China exercised an enormous fascination for Europe. Once Marco Polo comes back and writes his famous account, Europeans are fascinated with China, and Marco Polo told the Europeans that the cities he'd seen in China were far more advanced than any city in Europe. And those of you who have Eurocentrism on the brain, get used to it. Europe was not always on top, and China, up until around 1400, is considerably ahead of any European city. Back in the time of the Tang dynasty, the leading European city was Cordoba, which was under the Arabs. Not Paris, not Rome, not other places, in terms of technological development. So China is a place that Europeans are hearing about and thinking, oh, they're very advanced in many ways. And this, of course, is a completely fanciful portrayal by an Italian painter around 1400 of what China looked like in the imagination of Europe. The only point I'm making here is China has exercised considerable fascination for people in other places who never got to China back then. So in the Ming dynasty, it isn't just Marco Polo who goes traveling. Here's the area controlled by the Chinese in the Ming dynasty, which is 1368 to 1644. They had a Muslim admiral named Zheng He who took expeditions for the Chinese emperor. He worked for the Chinese emperor. He was Chinese language proficient. He took a variety of expeditions by ship, starting up here and coming in a series of 7 different voyages over that 28-year period, including voyages that went up into the Red Sea, down along the coast of East Africa, and they have found shipwrecks that have Chinese goods from those voyages over here along the coast of East Africa. This is a model of the ship that he sailed in, but they've actually found parts of these ships buried in silt that have been excavated by the archaeologists. And that's the size of Vasco da Gama's ship, which is roughly the size of the ship the ships that Columbus came to the US. You see how enormous the Chinese sailing ships were. So they had a period where they were exploring. From their perspective, they unfortunately made a terrible mistake, and the emperor, after this one, just shut it down, didn't want to have external exploration, said we've got to focus on the dangers coming overland from the west, meaning from Central Asia, and no more exploration by the Chinese. Big mistake, because just at the start of the age of exploration, the Chinese were potential rivals with Portugal, with Spain, with England, with France, with the other countries that were doing naval exploration back in the 15th and 16th century. So now we come up to the final dynasty, which is the Qing dynasty or the Manchu dynasty. The Manchus, who were from this part of northeast China, had come into China, and by 1644 they had conquered all of China and put themselves on the throne. So the final dynasty, which lasts from 1644 to 1911, is the Qing dynasty. They called themselves the Great Qing, but we can also refer to them as the Manchu dynasty because the emperors were Manchus. And the yellow part is what is under direct imperial, that's considered China proper at the time. The paler yellow were military garrisons controlling those areas, but they were under Chinese control. The orange color are what the Chinese considered tributary states. In other words, independent kingdoms that paid tribute to China, and in the Chinese point of view, thereby recognized China's civilizational superiority. They had no concept, the Chinese had no concept at this time of nation states trading as equal partners. China was the center of the universe, Zhongguo, Middle Kingdom, and everybody else was at varying degrees of distance from being at the pinnacle of civilization. This was not a culture that ever had any self-doubts that there was some other culture out there that was more advanced than they were. That's going to get them in real trouble, as we're about to see. In 1793, Lord McCartney comes out from England. England is suffering huge balance of payments problems because England is buying Chinese products with silver. The Chinese are exporting stuff, tea, silk, pig bristles, rhubarb. Vast quantities of this are all being shipped to England, cantonware, porcelains, and England and Europe are buying this, and England particularly has a balance of payments problem. The British, being very clever people at international trade, figure out the most wonderful, marvelous solution. Anybody remember what that was? Let's sell them opium. So the British raise opium in India, which they've taken over and is now mostly a British colony. They raise the opium in India. They take the opium to China, sell it to the Chinese. They bring the stuff back from China, and they reverse this balance of payments problem that they had. But in 1793, McCartney, now this is a Chinese portrayal of this famous meeting. Notice it's completely Chinese. The Chinese don't bother to show Lord McCartney looking anything other than a Chinese nobleman having an audience with the emperor. This is a satiric European version of the same meeting, in which both Lord McCartney is treated pretty well in this. He's made to look well, but look at the people who are supporting him, his entourages, and this portrayal of the Manchus is, of course, highly fanciful. It has nothing to do with the way they actually looked. Well, within 25 years after that, The British have been very successful selling opium. The Chinese begin to resist. Actually, 40 some years after that, they begin to resist, and this causes what's called the First Opium War, which was a war where the Chinese said, and they wrote a letter to Queen Victoria, who's on the throne by this time, brand new queen, and they said, Your Majesty, we understand it is illegal in your country to sell this product. Why is it you insist on selling it to us? Because that was the case. The British paid no attention to that because they had a very good thing going, financially speaking, making money hand over fist. It's all been routinized. There's a British opium service in India. It's a government agency growing opium and exporting it to China and other places in the world. The Chinese resist. The British have superior naval technology. They defeat the Chinese very handily in some battles between 1839 and 1842. That's a European rendition of the same. These were both European images. That leads to England gaining Hong Kong right down in here at the southern end of China, on the southern Chinese coast. The English get Hong Kong as a permanent colony. It's ceded to England in perpetuity. The Chinese have to pay the English reparations, and they get to open up. The English get to open up 4 treaty ports along here, and they get extraterritoriality. British people in those ports will not come under Chinese law. The Chinese word for this is the unequal treaties. They still call these the unequal treaties, that China was forced to make treaties with England and then later with France under coercion of military defeat. The Qing dynasty, the Manchus, were so frightened in the summer of 1842 when they signed the treaty in Nanking, that they gave away all of this stuff, and they didn't get the British to agree to stop importing opium. So they lost everything. And from a Chinese point of view, that's still living history. No Chinese forgets about the unequal treaties. So there's where Hong Kong is located, right down there. This is the island of Taiwan, sometimes called Formosa. There's the Korean peninsula up here. Here is Vietnam right here. This is Burma, and there's big India over there. At the same time that they're losing a couple of opium wars, the Manchu dynasty, China is losing opium wars, a lot of rebellions break out in China. So the middle of the 19th century sees huge rebellions. The most bloody and disruptive was called the Taiping Rebellion. It's an epileptic charcoal, semi-literate charcoal burner in Guangxi province. Let me show you, go back to the map. Right down in there, from South China. He gets hold of a missionary pamphlet, an inland Christian Protestant pamphlet, and he has dreams or seizures in which he believes that God comes to him along with Jesus Christ and says, you are the younger brother of Jesus Christ, and he becomes a visionary and begins to preach and rebel against the Qing dynasty. And that rebellion is simultaneous with Muslims rebelling in the northwest of China, in the southwest of China. This is a Chinese painting of putting down an Islamic rebellion, because there are Muslims living in China who are Chinese-speaking Muslims. They rebel. And here, this is showing you the area. That is the richest area of all China. Agriculturally, culturally, that's where silk, rice, the best tea, the very expensive export products and crops all come from that lower Yangtze Valley area. And the Taipings take that over and govern that for more than 10 years. At the end By 1864, when that rebellion is finally put down, 20 million people have died. Big deal, even in China. China has about 300 million people at this time. So even with 300 million people, to lose 20 million in one rebellion, and each of the other rebellions which took place over here, up in this area, these are both Islamic rebellions. There was another rebellion of a different religious sect up in this part of the Northeast. Each one of those had casualties of over 1 million each. So you see they're losing a lot of people in internal rebellions that had nothing to do with the Opium Wars. It's a very rough time. But the trauma and tragedy of the middle of the 19th century just gets worse. From the Chinese perspective, in 1894, the Japanese, who have modernized starting in 1868, they attack. China has real issues with Japanese aggression. It didn't start with World War II. In 1894, the Japanese attacked the Chinese, who are weak, and the Japanese have gotten stronger. And in less than a year, the Japanese handily defeat the much larger Chinese nation. Out of that defeat, Japan, in the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895, the Japanese get reparations that are twice the government's total annual budget. Reparations, the Japanese attack China. China's the victim. The victor attacks, and the victor says to the Chinese, now pay us. And the Chinese have to pay twice their total annual governmental budget to the Japanese, which forces them to borrow money from Europe. They borrow government bonds from Europe, so they become very indebted to Europe to pay off the Japanese, who were the aggressors at the time. But the Japanese don't just settle for money. They pick up this very lucrative property, the island of Taiwan and the Pescador Islands right in there. And those are ceded by China in 1895 to Japan in perpetuity. They are giving away territory to the Japanese forever. And the Japanese say, and by the way, we will now be the big shots in Korea, not you guys. Korea had been seen by China as a tributary state. From now on, the Japanese say, you're out, and Korea will be our tributary state. This, of course, is nothing to do with contemporary Japan. This is the Empire of Japan, which is going very aggressively, building itself up and strengthening at this point. Interestingly enough, the least important real estate that the Japanese took from China in that treaty at the end of the Japanese-Chinese War of 1894-95 is right here. The Japanese name for these islands is Senkaku. The Chinese name is Diaoyu, the Diaoyu Islands. The Japanese, when they got Taiwan and got the Pescadors, they also got the Senkakus. But of course, that's a treaty the Chinese have never accepted as being, it was coercion. It was highway robbery from their perspective. And that's one of the areas that's currently a big point of conflict between China, Japan, and Taiwan. But the Chinese don't mind that Taiwan, which is the closest zone to those islands, they don't mind that Taiwan claims them, because from a Chinese point of view, Taiwan is still part of China. So eventually, Taiwan will reunite with mainland China, and it'll all be one big China. And if Taiwan gets the Senkakus, China gets those islands back. The idea for the Chinese that the Japanese are in control of those islands because we put Japan as the administrators of the Senkaku Islands at the end of World War II. That was the U.S. made that decision in the outcome of the war. So China's got all kinds of issues with Japan from its history. While we're on this map, though, let me just show you. Here's something which I think the Chinese are way out of line, and I'm very critical of what China is doing. They are claiming that all of these islands were at one time in history under Chinese control. Very flimsy claim for these islands down here. The Spratlys, no, Chinese ships visited them when they were over there on fishing missions or just traveling. But China is claiming all these islands as being Chinese. The Spratlys are claimed by Taiwan, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia, which are all closer to these islands than mainland China is. So they're claiming the Scarborough Shoal, the Paracel Islands, the Spratlys down here, and the Senkakos up there. This is the one to watch out for, because Japan is not backing down on this. And that is a potential for major conflict in the Far East, is the dispute between China and Japan, neither one of which has been in a very good mood to actually negotiate with each other over this. These are hunks of rock, but it's the mineral rights that are really at play. The Manchus get a bad rap in China, which they bloody well deserve. The Empress Dowager, that's Empress Dowager Cixi, she used the naval funds in the late 1880s to refurbish this 18th century marble boat in the Summer Palace, which sits on land. It looks like a boat. It's actually sitting on land. And it's not even actually marble. It's wood, painted to look like marble. But she put the money into building that. The British had destroyed that in 1856 in the Second Opium War. She had it rebuilt, and she used the naval budget to do that rather than modernize the Chinese Navy. And by 1894, the Japanese this is what they should have been doing. This is what they needed but didn't have. The Japanese didn't have an aircraft carrier in 1895, but they had modern ironclad ships. This is now the first Chinese aircraft carrier, purchased from the Russians. Actually, I think they got it from the Ukraine, but it was built as part of the Soviet fleet at the very end of the Soviet Union. So here's a cartoon from Western press that very accurately describes the way the Chinese felt. In 1900, this, of course, is England, Victoria. That's the Kaiser in Germany. That's the Russian Tsar Nicholas II. That's France, all of which were carving up sections of China as their spheres of influence. And here's Japan sitting beside there saying, I don't want to carve it up. I want it all. A reminder of what the world looked like in 1910. On the eve of World War I, there you see all these colonial empires out there. This is the French Indochina. The U.S. has a colony called the Philippines, 1895 to 1945. Here's the Dutch East Indies. You've got Japan is owning Taiwan, Formosa, right there, and is in control of Korea. So it's the Portuguese are in Macau. That little red dot is actually Macau, which is Portuguese colony, small Portuguese colony. So it's a very different world before World War I starts than it will be by the end of World War II. So as if 1894-95 wasn't bad enough, the Japanese come back for a second helping. In 1931, they invade Manchuria, northeast China, and then in 1937, in July of 37, they invade China proper, and by December, they have gotten down to Nanjing, which is the capital under the nationalists. Nanjing means southern capital. Chiang Kai-shek has put the capital in the city of Nanking or Nanjing in 1928. And so when the Japanese come into Nanjing in December, by early to mid-December, they conquer the city of Nanjing. They're taking the national capital of China, which is a sovereign republic that they have invaded. There they are celebrating, doing the Banzai salute on the walls. Now, if you're old enough, you would remember the shock in America. I don't think anybody here is probably old enough to remember reading those newspapers, but this was very shocking to Americans. This bothered America. My mother was terribly, she told me how upset she was because she had affection for China. And she'd never been there, but when the Japanese kept attacking China, she was very concerned about it. Little did she know until the news came through how well placed that concern was, because unfortunately the Japanese Imperial Army decided to try to demoralize resistance by basically destroying the city of Nanjing and brutally murdering an awful lot of people. So here are people who the city has surrendered. The military have been disarmed, the police have been disarmed. The Japanese collected not only the surrendered captive soldiers and police, but all the civil servants, the school teachers, and they basically just kill all the men in the city of Nanjing who are between the ages of about 14 and 35 or 40. More than 200,000 non-combatants surrendered. People, disarmed people who are not resisting, are slaughtered in cold blood in a 10-week period. This is called the Rape of Nanjing. I actually had to edit out. I put some photos in. They're so horrific, I decided it was not, I shouldn't show them to you. If you want to see them, you can go online. But the reason, this is so awful, the reason there are these photos is the Japanese took these photos in pride. This appeared in a Japanese newspaper right at the time. These are two captains, that's the word for captain or major, I'm not sure about Japanese ranks, who had a contest to see which one could behead 100 people in a single day. And they actually beheaded with their swords 167 between the two of them in one day, which is bragged about in a newspaper for the home audience in Japan. That shows you something about what the Japanese Empire was like in terms of what went over with, that they would actually publish that in their home newspaper. There is a probably soldier, he's lost his right arm, and that's not staged. He's about to be beheaded. There were many other photos I have that actually show the beheading, and other photos showing scores, dozens of heads sitting on the ground in front of smiling, strutting Japanese officers. It's pretty rough stuff. Yes, sir?
Have you been to the new museum that's in Nanjing?
Oh, yes, yes. Very powerful, and you'll see many of these photos blown up in that museum, yeah. Alice and I were actually there in 1987 on the 50th anniversary of the massacre, and went. The museum was much smaller, much less well developed back then, but we went, and it was very powerful. There were a lot of elderly Chinese who were just unable to function during that period. So the year I was born, 1942, which is probably the peak of the Japanese imperial expansion, here you have a map showing just how much this complex of islands with about 100 million people or less, how much they've conquered between 1937 or actually they got that in 1931. But all the rest of this, they took this part from 1937, and then all of this they took when they attacked Pearl Harbor. So on Pearl Harbor Day, all of the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore down here, they sent their invasion forces into that part of the world. So even Guam and Wake Island, they conquered, which were U.S.-held islands. My parents and my parents-in-law both told me that the first 6 months after Pearl Harbor was very, very frightening because Japan was just conquering everything in its wake, and it took 6 months before we could begin to get a counter response. Skipping over the Civil War, because there's another tragedy that happens in China coming out of World War II, which they call the War of Resistance against Japan, and for them it lasted 8 years, and millions of people, millions of Chinese died in that war. The communists and the nationalists, immediately their united front falls apart, and by 1946 they're hard at it. Mao Zedong and the communists fighting Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, and in 3 years, in 1949, the nationalists lose, and they retreat to the island of Taiwan on U.S. naval ships. We took 1.5 million nationalist troops to Taiwan as their final fortress, and mainland China, after October 1st of 1949, is the People's Republic of China, and there's a photo of Mao. In the early years of the People's Republic, the communists do a lot of good things, especially from a Chinese point of view. The methods they use are questionable, if not barbaric. They had land reform, and they really did it, which is very hard for a Chinese government to do, and it needed doing. But unfortunately, the communists, following the exemplary model of Stalin and the Soviet Union, they used summary execution, and they executed about 1 million landowners just because they owned land. It was totally unnecessary. The nationalists did land reform in Taiwan with a much more humane way that actually worked better. But that's just part of it. Nonetheless, we have to give them credit that they did certain things. They introduced mass literacy campaigns. They began to bring public health into the rural areas. They tried to lift up the life of the peasants in the rural areas, at least for the first few years. Unfortunately, I'm skipping over some of the good stuff here. Unfortunately, Mao gets power mad and gets very, very unrealistic in his plans and wants to make revolution and achieve communism better than anybody else had ever done. He wants to outdo the Russians. And he's in 1958, he goes off the rails, in my opinion. The Chinese saying about Mao is Mao was 70% right and 30% wrong. I would flip that. 30% right, 70% wrong, because of what he does is so awful. He gets the idea that any kind of private ownership is bad, and he wants to organize the peasants into communes. The farmers are put into communes, and communes are not like communes in Vermont. It's not a couple of families working together. This is 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 people, all put under bureaucratic control. Of course, everything run by the Communist Party. And he gets this absolutely wacky, ludicrous idea, which his scientists and engineers tell him, or try to send the message up, not a good idea, don't do it. They're immediately silenced. Lots of them are put in jail for even having said so. Mao says we're going to have backyard steel furnaces, and we're going to outstrip England's steel production by having everybody in the farmland build these little tiny backyard furnaces. And they then, I mean, we've talked to a lot of people who remember this. They came through, and you had to give them your pots and pans that you cook with, your tools, the farmers' tools. The window casings that were made out of metal were taken out of the homes in Shanghai and sent into the countryside. Door frames, doorknobs. Metal just disappears, and if you don't contribute your metal, you're in trouble with the authorities. And so they bring it all out, and they melt it in these backyard furnaces, producing junk, just slag, just absolutely useless. They've taken good metal and turned it into just lumps of unusable metal. And Mao brags that they've raised their steel production by some fantastic sum. This leads to the worst famine in history in our lifetime. If you were alive in 1959, you lived through the worst recorded famine we know about, which the Chinese government managed to hide. We knew there was a famine. We had no idea how bad it was. And in fact, a little factoid, interesting, it's the demographers at the CIA who in 1980, the first time the Chinese issue a census, they backtrack, do the math, and they say there's 20 to 30 million people missing who disappear around 1960 from the population figures that China revealed. And the Chinese now admit that there was a famine. What they are still unwilling to admit is that Mao Zedong personally is responsible for the death of those. It's not 20 million. It's much more likely to be 30 to 40 million people. The poor people, the poor peasants for whom Mao made the revolution, are the victims. It was the peasants living in the poor areas who starved to death. And they starved to death because of Mao's face. He has to save face. He will not admit that he went too far, that his plans were unrealistic. And he crushes anyone inside the Chinese Communist Party who says, Chairman, we've gone too far. The peasants, our people, the folks who made this revolution with us are starving to death. And Mao just absolutely squashed any criticism. So the photos are very, very few. It was illegal to use the word famine. It was illegal for a doctor to give a prescription, a diagnosis of malnutrition. This was illegal. It was illegal to in any way refer in China, while people are starving to death, to refer to the fact that they're starving to death. So nobody took photos of it because it was so dangerous. So there are very, very few photos. This is a photo, this is a photo. There are very, very few photos from that period. All right, that's another tragedy that China goes through. Jumping forward, are they done yet? Nope. Got one more really big one to go through. Mao is aging. He wants to make sure his revolution is permanent, so he and his absolutely horrific wife, Jiang Qing, Madame Mao, launch, along with some other radicals, launch the Cultural Revolution in 1966 and throw China, which has just begun to recover from the famine, they throw it back into chaos for another 10 years, especially from 66 to 69. It's just anarchy. It's madness. 2/3 of the Communist Party officials who have been running the country since 1949 are declared to be capitalist revisionist counter-revolutionaries and are sent into, at best, house arrest. Most of them get sent into labor camps, re-education camps. Can you imagine taking 2/3 of your managerial people out and then saying to teenagers, the Red Guards, you run this? They are hostile to anything that's old. Anything that's old. This is the stuff that made Chinese people proud to be Chinese for thousands of years. These cultural radicals come along and say, all the stuff that's old is feudalistic, backward, and bad. It's bad for people. So here you have Buddhist statues being burned. This is the only time you would see this since the 9th century, when there was an anti-Buddhist emperor who did some temple burning, but this is the only time you would see Chinese people burning religious objects. And those folks with the dunce caps on are leaders who are being now humiliated publicly, often physically abused, very badly treated. That's not a very good image, I know, but it's a statue of Confucius, who's a sacred figure in Chinese history, and the sign on it says, the #1 big bastard. And some people were executed simply for having been in the wrong place in the wrong time and declared to be counter-revolutionaries, whether they were or they weren't. They get through that. It ends in 76 with the death of Mao, but just a few months before Mao dies, China's worst earthquake hits the city of Tangshan, and a city of 1 million people looks like Hiroshima. On one night, the earthquake came at 3:45 in the morning. Everybody was asleep in the houses. The houses were cheap construction. They all fell down, and 500 to 600,000 people died in a period of 24 hours because there was an aftershock 16 hours later. We've talked to survivors who lived through this, and it's just, they walked out. If they lived, they came out and everybody was dead and there were no buildings standing. Okay, bringing things up to the present, a few before and after shots. When I first went to China, it was 1963, and I went with my parents from Taiwan to Hong Kong in 63, and this is what Hong Kong looked like, looking from the peak. This photo is actually from the late 60s, but it looked very much like this in 1963 when I first saw it, and it looked like this in 1970, 71 when I lived there for 15 months. That's what it looks like now. But it isn't just Hong Kong. I wanted to say a little bit about the Hong Kong demonstrations because it was something of a big deal. It took place last October. A whole lot of young people in Hong Kong got out on the streets and for several weeks tied up traffic. And what they're protesting is that the election, they were promised that there'd be universal suffrage with direct election of the government of Hong Kong for 2017. In late September, the news came out that there would be universal suffrage for the first time. There would be a democratic election, but the nominating process would still be controlled by Beijing's hand-picked committee. And that's what put them out on the streets. These were exemplary demonstrations, no violence. They never deteriorated. The discipline of the young students was fantastic. Now, the research I did about this at the time says, in fact, this is not about democracy in China. These people were not a continuation of June, the spring of 1989, and the democracy movement. They're protesting for local control, but the real motive force is the growing gap between the rich and the poor, which in Hong Kong is, even though it's a very wealthy city, it's having the same kind of phenomenon of the super wealthy running the show, and the Chinese work hand in glove with the super wealthy. And they work with Beijing. But an awful lot of people in the bottom half of society are feeling that they're living in a rigged game. And whereas in the past, in Hong Kong, by hard work, you could work yourself up, they're losing faith that the system under the communists, they're looking at it and saying, we were better off when we were a British colony. We had more chance to work hard and make our way up. There was more upward mobility then than there is now. That's a big hidden part of these demonstrations, according to the analysis that I read. Another thing China did at the end of 2013, they established, just a little over a year ago, China all of a sudden, Japan did this in 1969. 1969, China's in the Cultural Revolution. China's not completely convulsed. They can't pay attention to what's happening outside of China. Japanese say this is an era. If you fly into this zone, you have to identify yourself to Japanese air control, which is a form of some kind of sovereignty in space, aerospace. In December of 2013, the Chinese said, well, we never accepted that Japanese unilateral move. We now declare our own ADIZ, Airspace, Air Defense Identification Zone, And you see, here's the Chinese ADIZ, and it intersects with Japan's, and the Senkaku Islands are right there inside both countries' air defense identification zones. This is the new leader of China, became the number one guy 2.5 years ago, Xi Jinping. He has all three of the top titles. His predecessors did not. So he has become not first among equals. He's just the top dog. And the other 6 people in the Standing Committee of the Politburo are not anywhere comparable to him. He has a lot of ambition. He wants to be a transformative figure. He is ruthless. He is tough. He is absolutely a committed nationalist who thinks China has been mistreated by history and by the rest of the world. And he is intending to turn China into maybe not the most powerful country in the world in his lifetime, but to keep China on a course of development where someday China does become the number one superpower in the world. He's doing some good stuff with anti-corruption, but while he does it, he is also taken China backward. There is now more interference with the internet. There's more jailing of journalists. There's more jailing of dissidents, people who say things that are out of line. It's like going back to the Maoist period in terms of the repression of freedom of expression and thought in the People's Republic of China. He's much worse in that regard than his 3 predecessors. There are the 7 most powerful men. That is Xi leaning forward right there. Powerful army, increased naval budget. They have lots of first-rate nuclear submarines with high technology, nuclear weapons. This is not a country that can be pushed around by Russia, by the United States, by Japan, or by anybody else. Not saying that they are attempting to project their power and threaten the existing status quo outside of their borders. They may in the future. I don't think they're doing that yet. But this is not anybody who talks about having a war with China is in fantasy land. Yes, the United States has the capacity to destroy any country on the planet. We have so many nuclear weapons. Yes, we could destroy China, but they could get nuclear weapons to us. We wouldn't be able to do it without paying a very heavy price. And just to finish up with a few more, this is what Shenzhen looked like in 1980. I first was there in 1972 when I crossed into China. And I walked through the train station there into China in March of '72, right after the Nixon-Kissinger visit, as part of a friendship delegation. And that's what it looked like. I'm sorry it's not a clear picture. It's a poor quality photo. But that's very much what I remember seeing in 1972, and this is 1980. It still looked the same as it did in '72. What can I say? That's now about 7 million people living in that space you just saw. In fact, if I had a photo from 1987, there'd be a few buildings there in '87, but no high-rises. That's what it looks like now. If you were in Shanghai, Alice and I were first in Shanghai in 1987, and you go up in a tall building in Shanghai. This area right in here is called the Bund. This is the old colonial zone on the west bank of the Huangpu River. This is what we saw in 1987, when we first saw that. that was mostly green. Those buildings weren't there in 87. Are you ready for what it looks like now? Anywhere you went in China up into the mid-'80s, I'm sure some of you were visited China before the late 80s. If you were in any Chinese city in up until the late 80s, this is what you saw. Just masses and masses of bicycles and no private cars, not many motor vehicles at all. That's the main street that runs east-west. That's where some of the killing took place in the massacre of June the 4th, 1989. Chang'an Street. That's what Chang'an Street looks like nowadays. Even 7, 8 years ago, that's what it looks like. People who used to ride bikes in China don't want to ride bikes anymore because the traffic is just too dangerous for bicycling. There's the central business district of Beijing as it looked a couple years ago. When I first went there, there was not a single tall building. In 1972, no tall building at all. Something else that's really sad and very, very worrisome for the Chinese citizens, and they're really upset about it, and they are scaring their own communist dictatorship government. They are so unhappy, is the air pollution problem. I won't go to most Chinese cities now in the wintertime. It's too hard on my lungs. So here are people doing Tai Chi Chuan. That's not fog. I wish it were fog. That's just very high particular concentrated air pollution. Here's a different Chinese city a year ago. That's the actual date. Again, that is not fog. It is not smog. It is air pollution. But let's remember, rural China is still there. Now, half of China lives in cities and suburbs, but there's still half of China that lives in farmland, in agricultural zones. And their standard of living has gone up dramatically, too, if they're in a zone where the agricultural production is good, where they can make money. The people who are living in poor zones are still in real trouble. That's just a reminder of the population of China. Those people are waiting to get inside the train station where they can line up to buy a ticket in a train station that is a huge train station that's as crowded inside as it is outside. Can you imagine waiting to get into the line with that kind of crowd? But at New Year's time, people want to go home for New Year's. And it's important to remember, China is still a poor country. And there are a lot of poor people who are really poor, who live on a couple dollars a day per person. And that's no fun in China. You really can't eat enough on $2 a day. However, this is equally important. And when you get into your, as I often do, into my anti-communist mode and regret and grieve over how badly the communists did so many things, at the same time, fair is fair. No other government or society has ever moved that number of people out of poverty in that amount of time. Never been done. So they did it. Could they have done it better? You bet they could have done it better, but they did it. And that's why they're still in power. In my view, they would not still be in power if they hadn't done that. So, When we lived in Nanjing in 87, 88, we would have wept to see, my wife and I would have wept to see a grocery store like that. We had two young children there. We couldn't get food that our kids would eat. We had grave difficulty in a major city with greenbacks. We had American money. We had the foreign exchange coupons. We couldn't buy the food that we wanted to eat. It just wasn't available in the wintertime. Now, this is absolutely normal in most parts of China. And they are developing wealthy suburbs on the edges of their big cities for the people who, the top 10% of the country, top 10% of China is a lot of people. Now, this is the kind of image Chinese love to show us, especially if they know the United States. Because they're looking at us and they're saying, hey, you have much more money than we do. Never mind that they're our mortgage banker. We borrow scandalous amounts of money to fuel our consumption that we do with debt. We borrow it every month from China and from Japan. I'm preaching now, but this is an economic fact we don't like to look at. We are living on borrowed money to keep our consumption levels really, really high. I'm a fiscal conservative, right? So I don't think that's a good idea. The Chinese look at us and say, number one, you're borrowing money, which they don't believe in doing that. If consumption's low because you haven't got enough money, it stays low until you make more money so you can, right, without borrowing. And they look at us and they say, where are your infrastructure projects? Because they're doing this over a country that's almost the size of our country. They are putting in high-speed rail to link up the entire country, all the major cities. It's an enormous investment. Okay, you can say it's probably true that they're doing that to artificially stimulate their economy and prime the pump, but they're going to have really good, superior infrastructure when they get to, they do borrow money for this kind of thing. Yeah, they're borrowing money, but to borrow money to do this versus borrowing money, which is, for, you know what we borrow money for. Come on, we're all Americans here. You know what we borrow money for. We're not borrowing money to build high-speed rail. So when we get contemptuous or condescending to the Chinese and talk to them about all their sins and all their backwardness, we need to have a little bit of balance in our own perspective of how they look at, what do they see when they look at us. They have admired us from afar for the whole history of the United States. For 200 years, the Chinese have basically admired the United States and looked at us as a place that had a lot of good things that they would like to have. They're now having doubts about whether or not we represent the future and whether or not we're the people that they should be copying or emulating or learning from. They're no longer willing to take advice from us about how to run an economy. They told us a few years ago, stop preaching to us about fiscal responsibility. This is now common in all Chinese cities. By the way, there are 145 cities in China that have 1 million people or more. The United States has, I think, about 10 or 11 cities that have more than 1 million people. They have 145 cities with a population above 1 million. Most of them you've never heard of. So back to that question about purchasing power at the beginning. Yeah, a lot of Chinese people don't have much disposable income, but enough of them do that all the Western, that bag could be pirated. It could be a pirated Gucci bag, but there's a Gucci store in all the big cities where it's not pirated stuff and where they're selling a blouse for $500 US and people are going in and buying it. So there are some extraordinarily wealthy people. The last count I saw was 130,000 millionaires in China. So there are people there with real money. And now when we travel around the world, brand new ball game. 25 years ago, we'd see Japanese tourists everywhere. We never saw Chinese tourists. Now, everywhere we go. Alice and I were in Turkey in October. We're out in the middle of Cappadocia, inland Turkey, and here comes a bus, and everybody getting off the bus is speaking Northern Chinese. And they're tourists there just like we are. So, it's a whole new ball game. That's the end of my discussion. Let me repeat the question for you. This lady is saying, where did all these people come from? She knows about the very strict one-child population control policy, which they had for more than 30 years, and that's true. They reduced their fertility rate in a very dramatic fashion between the late 70s and, let's say, 2005. They're starting to ease off on that a little bit now, but you're absolutely right. They slowed. The population continued to grow, but they slowed the population growth. Let me give you, just on that subject of population, and then I'll get to the other question. Then she said, where are all these people coming into the cities from? Is there now empty space out in the countryside? And the quick answer to that is no, you don't find a lot of empty space in China. But let me address population, because I think it's an interesting contrast. Just 10 years ago, less than 10 years ago, India hit 1 billion. China at that point had slightly under 1.3 billion. This is 10 years ago. India's population, India has 1/3 the territory that China does. India's population is now 1.2 billion in 10 years. So, is China a crowded place that's overpopulated, especially from a Vermont perspective? You bet. You bet it is overpopulated, in my view. I think the United States is overpopulated with I think we're now 317 million, or roughly there. Maybe it's some 315. Anybody know what our current, it's around 315 million. To me, we've got more than enough people in the United States. But then I live in Vermont, and I've lived here a long time, so I have Vermont consciousness. India doesn't have effective population family planning programs, and they have religions that won't tolerate it. Most religions in India most of the religious faiths in India, which are much stronger than any organized religious faith in China, are not receptive to the idea of strict population limits or family planning programs. As I understand it, I'm no specialist on India, that's my understanding. We know that China had a very strict policy. So India will now overtake China as the world's most populous nation within 25 years. And India has 1/3 the geographical space of China. So I used to talk a lot about China being terribly overpopulated and overpopulation being the curse of China. And I still feel it is. And most of our Chinese friends feel this way. They hated the one-child policy, but the educated people supported it because they felt the situation was so desperate with population growth, they had to go to that terribly restrictive and very unpleasant series of policies. India, India should be just this giant success story. They've got so many good things going for them, but they have runaway population growth. So I care about India, and I worry about India. And I have no answer to that problem. So the other part of your question was, where did the people come from? They came from the countryside, because as the agricultural got more mechanized, they didn't need all the labor. There was surplus labor in the countryside. And when Deng Xiaoping in the early 80s said, we are going to get rich, and the way we're going to get rich and get strong, remember Fu Qiang, we're going to get rich and we're going to get strong. And we can't be strong if we don't get rich. We got to have Fu, prosperity, in order to have Qiang, which is strength, military strength as well. Deng said, we got to let these, why I showed you the slide of Shenzhen, where it was just bare fields in 1880 and it's now this giant metropolis. That was the first special economic zone. Deng Xiaoping said, we're going to let foreign capital come into Shenzhen and put factories there, and we'll let them take profits out, which is against Maoist economic theory. And it worked. And so China, over time, they had very high education, they had low levels of illiteracy by 1975. When the communists took control in 1949, less than half of the Chinese people were literate. They raised that up to 75% in 25 years, 75% or higher. So with an educated population, with a strong work ethic, and that's not unusual to China. Lots of cultures have a strong work ethic. India, as a matter of fact, has a strong work ethic. Japan, Korea, a lot of Asian countries have strong work ethics. But when you got out from under the horrible restraints of Communist Party-controlled bureaucratism, that's what they needed to free themselves from. And Deng Xiaoping basically did it. And you know, we see the results. Did that address your question? Yes, thank you. Yes. You've answered your own question. It is a huge problem. There's a real estate bubble in China that is staggering. It's staggering. I do not encourage anyone to invest in Chinese real estate. Not that anybody's asked me, do I encourage that or not, but here's the one good part of that. There are empty cities. There are ghost cities that have been built where nobody's living in them. They got all the facilities and nobody moves in. And they do it to artificially keep their wages up. It's government, it's welfare. It's a form of welfare. And of course it's corrupt. It's incredibly corrupt because the people who do buildings steal land from the peasants, pay them a nickel on the dollar. They're in cahoots with the local communities, and the local power structure, which is Communist Party members, and the builders get together. They screw the peasants out of their land because the peasants don't own their land. They have the use of the land. They use eminent domain to do it. It's a national scandal. And they've been doing it for 20 years. The government's now finally clamping down on that, but they built all these ghost towns, or half-inhabited towns. The good thing about that is if they spend the money on maintenance, as the standard of living rises in those areas, people will get enough money to buy an apartment and move in. And it's a big improvement in their quality of life to get out of a hovel into an apartment with electricity, running water, elevator, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a private bathroom. So it's not good economic practice, but it's not necessarily total disaster or total waste. Yes. Oh, that is an excellent question. Could everybody hear the question? How does the average citizen in China feel about living under this kind of state, this kind of system of political monopoly of power by the Communist Party? Well, it's a great question, but again, there's no simple answer to that question because the Chinese are like everybody else. They are all over the map. They have every kind of, from total support of the status quo to people who want to hang every communist from a light pole, and there are those people in China. They're a minority, but they do exist. From those two spectrums, there's every position all the way along. When you talk to a lot of people, you hear the majority of people would like to have the government interfere with certain kinds of freedom less. They don't like the government interference with the internet. And the government censorship of the internet in China is profound. If you type an internet message in Chinese and you use any of several hundred words in your message, it will immediately be blocked by automatic censoring capacity. They're very good at that. Their firewall, the Great Firewall. Chinese people don't like that. Chinese people did not like the one-child policy. But what Chinese people are more, as far as I can tell, and I have to be honest, we have not been back to China for 3 years. So the last time I had a chance to talk to a lot of people was 3 years ago. But every time we go, we talk to a lot of people from different walks of life, just trying to get a sense of where's the average citizen at right now. The big concern for most people is not that the Communist Party is a dictatorship and they wish to have democracy. That is what the intellectuals of China definitely feel. Most intellectuals in China are very aware that they would prefer democracy. But when you talk to the average citizen, their concern is much more things like air pollution, safe food. Food is a huge issue because the Chinese don't have a Food and Drug Administration, and they don't have good administration of that kind of thing. So people in China are scared to death they're going to eat something that's going to poison them because somebody was a good entrepreneur and made milk powder using plastic or rat poison. I mean, it literally happened. They literally had babies die from milk powder that had rat poison in them to make it. The cement that goes into the buildings, the contractors cheat on the cement, put in too much sand, you get an earthquake, and giant buildings fall down. That is on the minds of everybody, because everybody feels threatened by that. So a lot of people are conflicted in terms of they're like everybody else in the world. They want their cake and eat it too. They say, we'd like to have more freedom than we've got, but we want the government to stop the air pollution. We can't stop it. Only the government can stop it. So if the government goes in there and really cracks down on air pollution, yippee. And then you say to them, well, you realize you are now driving a car. If the government's going to crack down on air pollution, they're going to tell you you can only drive your car 1 day out of 3. Oh, I don't want that. No. I want to drive my car every day, have somebody else drive his car 3 times. I mean, they're just people like the rest of us. It's a great question. Did you all hear the question? The description of what's healthcare like? What's the medical situation in China like? Well, again, it's a mixed bag. If I could just go back to the previous very useful observation from somebody who's lived there and who clearly knows a lot about the place, which I think also will address your question. The important thing, I think, to remember with the Chinese is, like everybody else, they're making their judgments of the status quo, of what is like now, based on what they experienced. Given what I've just shown you about the last 150, 180 years of Chinese history, you can understand that if they have peace and reasonable prosperity for any length of time, to a Chinese person, that's cause for celebration. That's a very big deal. And they do fear chaos. This is one of the problems that the democracy advocates have in China, is the last time the government took its hands off the people was the Cultural Revolution. And anybody who lived for the Cultural Revolution will do almost anything not to live through that again. When you empower junior high school people to go out and execute revolutionary justice against ordinary citizens. The last people you want to be judged by are 13-year-olds. I mean, think of it. Putting guns into the hands of 13-year-olds and saying, okay, you folks are going to be in charge. You figure out who the bad guys are and repress them. That kind of craziness actually happened in the memory of everybody who's my age in China. So what he says is absolutely what I'm trying to convey, which is from their perspective, they haven't had it this good for 200 years. And they give Deng Xiaoping a whole lot of credit for that. They're a lot more ambivalent about Mao. But medical care, it's a mixed bag. And in some ways, it's not that dissimilar from the United States. If you have money, you get excellent medical care in China. If you don't have money, you're not going to get. I mean, that's where the difference is. If you're poor in China, you're not going to get it. Here, we are rich enough as a country and humane enough as a country, we try to have good medical attention available, good care, even expensive care, for people who don't have the money to be able to pay for it. So that's one of their big problems, is that 30 years ago, 40 years ago, they had decent low-level care for everybody, and it was free. Let me tell you an anecdote. My wife and I went to China with a 6-year-old son and a 4-year-old daughter in 1987. Sixth night in China, our son fell out of the upper bunk of a bed onto a cement floor and cracked his skull. We had to go to the emergency hospital in the city of Nanjing. He had a hematoma. He had a blood clot between his brain and a fracture of his skull right in this area. Happy ending. Everything turned out fine. He's got a scar for life that runs right here, but he's totally normal and healthy and no problem. When we found out that the best 2 brain surgeons in the province of Jiangsu, which have 70 million people in that one state, it's about the size of Ohio, we found that the best 2 brain surgeons in that province were brought in to do the removal of the blood clot. The governor of the province had called the hospital and said, "Are you listening? The foreign child will not die. Do I make myself clear?" says the governor. We found out about all this later. Here's the story. 1987, the barber who shaved our son's head was paid a dime, US money. The 2 brain surgeons were paid a nickel apiece. That was the old system. And you say, well, no, that's just completely impossible. You're right, it didn't actually work that way. The families would give gifts to the surgeons because the surgeons weren't getting paid as much as the barbers, thanks to Maoist revolutionary idealism, right? That's all gone. That's all been changed. They've rationalized their system, and doctors now get decent salaries to do skilled medical treatment, and a brain surgeon gets paid more than a barber or even gets paid more than a nurse. But not in 1987. It was still the old socialist system that any kind of payment for intellectual people was perpetuation of a feudalistic, bourgeois, counter-revolutionary past.
What's so amazing to me is that within a decade, things can change. Where else in the world can things change so rapidly? So in 10 years, another decade, who knows?
Did you all hear that? Things can change fast. It was longer than a decade. It was a 25 to 30 year period that things changed profoundly, but they have changed They have changed profoundly. Something else that system did, which is quite amazing. They had 75 million people who worked in state-owned enterprises who were laid off in the late 1990s. Can you imagine? And it's cruel. You've been working in a factory, you're 50 years old, you've been in that factory since you were 20, and you're just fired, and they closed down the factory because it's an unprofitable factory. They managed to do that without having a social revolution. Those people did not starve to death. They found ways. They didn't have a good life afterwards. They couldn't make it up for them. They lost out, but China got rid of really useless state-run enterprises that never turned a profit, that only lost money. Their banking system is still not what it should be. The whole problem of credit with the Communist Party interfering in the markets is serious. It's a last place to put your money after real estate is in Chinese banks. They make money, but they're making money artificially because the state is interfering. Okay, but before we get high and mighty about that, ever hear of too big to fail? Our 5 biggest banks, the government will not let them go broke when they have been playing games and speculating, and they deserve to go broke. We will not let them go broke because it'll bring down the whole system. So, I'll answer it afterwards.